I always wonder what one of my two irreverent daughters, how they would conduct the introduction. It would probably be slightly different. I'm honored to be here, and it's too bad Ambassador Park's not here, but I'd like to thank him through you for this opportunity. There could be no better place to introduce a book, which I hope will have some both policy and scholarship traction. I actually wouldn't be here in Korea, except I now come regularly to the Graduate Institute of Peace at Kyunghee University, and my kind host, the rector, Professor Kwok, is here. Sue, when I asked you, how long should I speak? And she calculated and called Ambassador Park and came back and said, well, how about 45 minutes? I said, terrific. But I didn't tell her why I agreed to that. She has many claims to fame, including the fact that she survived 2 seminars with me in New York. And graduate students tend to be a little more respectful of gray hairs and age. But before being at the Graduate Center, I taught at Brown University. And at the end of courses, one would hand out a questionnaire and say, well, what do you like, what do you not like? And I was never quite sure what to do with these, because about half would say, we read too much, and the other half would say, oh, read too little. He talks too much, he talks too little. But there was one question at the end which you could say anything that you wanted to say, and I always found those the most interesting. And so I was flipping through these toward the end of my tenure there, and there was one that had not exactly a lot to do with international relations or global governance. And it said, if I had a terminal disease, where would I like to spend the last hour of my life? And the answer, of course, was Weiss's seminar, because the last hour seemed like an eternity. So I'm going to try to speak for less than an hour today. Would the world be better without the UN? Answering that question actually would be important at any moment in time since 1945, but it's all the more critical in the age of Donald Trump, and even more pressing for me anyway, since the appointment of the former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, because neither of those men has ever seen an ally they couldn't get rid of, a war they didn't like, or an international institution that was worth anything. So in case you can't hold your breath, Soo-Yoon has already spoiled it, but on page 190, the answer is no. Now, you might have guessed that because former Secretary General Kofi Annan actually wrote the foreword. But in order to get to that point, I ask what I think is quite an honest question. And I put forward some facts. Some of them are pretty uncomfortable, not alternative facts, but uncomfortable facts for both foes and friends of the World Organization. So if you get a chance to read the book, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is that I try to look at contributions by the UN, and the 2 ways I think the UN has made a contribution. The first in terms of ideas, norms, principles, standards, and the second in terms of concrete operations. And I try to discuss across the book the 3 main pillars of activities: peace and security, human rights and humanitarian affairs, and finally, sustainable development. So the book involves a 2-part counterfactual. And part 1 consists of illustrations of how the world would have been far worse off at several crucial junctures without inputs from the UN system. That part of the book is designed to make slightly uncomfortable the Heritage Foundation and members of this administration, or at least give them pause in their declared war on a rules-based international order that the United States has actually helped create and certainly nourished since World War II. So, what's the evidence? I'm not actually going to run through this because I'd like to focus on a couple of other issues. But it would be hard to argue that the world would be a better place without both efforts by the first UN of member states and the second UN of international civil service, like Suyun, who are working for the organization. Denying that proposition would involve, among other things, trying to say that we wouldn't be worse off, for example, without the campaign to have eliminated smallpox in 1977, and the ones underway right now that have almost succeeded for polio and guinea worm, or the efforts over time to try to articulate and advocate for women's rights, or Professor Jung, the efforts of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to change the conversation about the climate, or emergency victims in the Congo or Sudan, to keep the peace on the Golan Heights, where we saw this morning or yesterday evening some rockets from Iranian forces into Israel, or the peace in Kashmir, Cyprus, and a host of other places, to have facilitated decolonization in the early years, and to have made halting efforts to protect cultural heritage in places like Palmyra, and now to prosecute war criminals. Now, I understood that a recent speaker here, my colleague John Mearsheimer, he would undoubtedly argue the title of probably his most famous article, which was The False Promise of International Institutions. My argument is quite the opposite. It's the unrealized promise of multilateralism and international cooperation. So, while counterfactuals are usually considered the toys of social scientists, I really think that they're helpful to try to focus the mind and try to ask some tough questions. So, as I say, the efforts that I try to lay out, the stories I try to tell in the first half of the book, are not alternative facts, although it's not inconceivable that members of the current administration in Washington would so interpret them. I think most people will acknowledge them as essential contributions to a more habitable planet. However, the second half of the book involves a second counterfactual, and this is about the debits for the organization. And it is silly to pretend that there are not some huge debits as well. So this half of the book is intended for cheerleaders with blue pom-poms, because it's impossible to argue that the world would also be a far better place with different kinds of efforts by member states and better efforts by the International Civil Service. For instance, if the Security Council, its permanent members and its elected members, had been less hypocritical in Rwanda in 1994, or currently in Syria, Myanmar, you can list those cases. Or, if peacekeepers had raped fewer kids in Central Africa, or perhaps spread less cholera in Haiti, or that more dedicated staff performed better in their development projects, humanitarian efforts, or in monitoring the behavior of states, being sort of less obsequious with the member states. And of course, if the organizations of the system actually pulled together instead of protecting their own turf. So, in short, the second half of the book explores how much better off we might be with better performances by the 193 member states and the 100,000 or so civilians, and more or less the same number of police and military who are serving the UN at this moment in time. Now, my own, Suyun mentioned that I've been working on these issues for a long time. I hate to think how many years. But when I applied for a grant to write this book of the Carnegie Corporation in New York, I thought that I really conceived of the book in the way it's laid out, but I was going to try to finish it next year in the lead up to the 75th anniversary of the UN in 2020. After the election of Donald Trump, I felt that compelled to move more quickly. It seems to me that it's it's not less urgent, it's far more urgent. And so while lots of my compatriots, and perhaps some of you, have lots of things to criticism, misogyny, racism, bad taxes, throwing allies under the bus, forgetting about international cooperation, not everyone's list includes my topic, which is multilateralism. I think it should, because not only the United States, but the planet and Korea and everybody else will definitely not be better off with less multilateralism and a feebler or non-existent UN. Let's just think about the various major points in 2017. He began the year by cutting completely the funding for the Population Fund, the group in the UN that focuses on women and girls' reproductive health. At the end of the year, pulled completely out of UNESCO, while US funding had been eliminated, the US still participated and was still an important member. The end of the year was pulling out of UNESCO. In between, a few other things, getting out of the UN-brokered Paris Climate Agreement, September, pulling out of the Compact on Migration, a sensible effort to try to make policy recommendations about supposedly the key issues of refugees and migrants, rather than building a wall. Then the proposal to move the capital Jerusalem, which happens on Monday, and then when other member states, virtually every other member state, said this was not exactly a good idea, the reaction was to cut half of the budget for the UN Relief and Works Agency that helps Palestinians. So, I can run through lots of cases during the Q&A, but I thought I really would like to focus on the meaning of the bottom line in my book for the United Nations in the age of Trump. So, the UN is not a four-letter word, it's actually a two-letter invective. And so I'd like to do three things. The first is to try to put Trump's performance to date and his first speech at the General Assembly last September in a historical context. I'd like to try to discuss the implications of America First, which I translate as America über alles, and then try to say, well, what are the possibilities for change on First Avenue? So let me begin with the historical context. One of the projects I've been involved in over the years is an intellectual history of the United Nations, and I did a lot of interviews with people who were around at the founding. One of those is a real friend of mine, a real giant, Sir Brian Urquhart, who was the second official recruited to that second UN in 1946 after having served in the European Front. He worked at the UN for 41 years. And I said, Brian, what's the real problem? He said, my dear friend Tom, the UN is the last bastion of state sovereignty. He was lamenting, of course, the inability to help people whose rights were being repressed or who were being attacked in war zones. And the reason, of course, was that their presidents or their princes or their prime ministers claimed that what they did at home was exclusively their own business. And for decades, the rest of the UN agreed. More recently, we've seen movements on the normative front with a responsibility to protect, and occasionally we revoke the license for mass murder by sovereign thugs. In addition, of course, states have signed numerous treaties. There are almost 600 in the UN for monitoring. And of course, with globalization, whether it's financial transfers, ideas, technologies, governments are no longer able to halt certain kinds of invasions. So in short, sovereignty ain't quite what it used to be. Nonetheless, the UN Charter, and really the Charter or the Constitution of virtually every other intergovernmental organization, focuses on that word. And Trump for those of you who were counting, I was, used it 21 times in his first speech to the UN. Now, he spoke 3 times as long as he was supposed to, so perhaps the numbers are inflated, but 21 times. Now, his mantra was really quite well received by such human rights champions as Russia and China and Myanmar and Zimbabwe and Nicaragua and on and on. These states used to emphasize sovereignty to ward off criticism by Washington. Well, that's no longer the case. You don't have to be an Obama groupie to go back and appreciate his first speech, which used the word once. And the use of the term once was to underline why U.S. interests were served through international cooperation, including the United Nations. So I'm reminded that this kind of mindless, literally mindless patriotism and wrapping oneself in the flag is what the critic Samuel Johnson characterized as kind of the last refuge of scoundrels. You can explain away all problems this way. And so while the president and the vice president have tried to square the circle, alas, America first means America alone. And I'm going to circle back to that in a minute. This is in the face of rather an unconvincing stance, I'd have to say, in the age in which the face of reality of contemporary world politics and problem solving, but also in the face of some significant contributions from the UN, hence this book. Now, I'm not the first person to point to the origin of this term, America First. The America First Committee, for those of you who haven't studied this, was the shortest lived, best organized anti-war movement ever, founded in 1940 by not some of my favorite people, proto-fascists Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, Father Coughlin. Recently, because I was giving a similar talk at the university, Michigan State University Law School, I went back and looked at some archives. The Republican senator from the state of Michigan, whose name was Arthur Vandenberg during World War II, was a really enthusiastic supporter of America First until Pearl Harbor. At the end of the war, Vandenberg, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wanted to ensure that the United States was the first country to ratify the UN Charter. And he said at that time, "I do not believe that any nation hereafter, after World War II and World War I, can immunize itself by its own exclusive action." Well, what was true for Arthur Vandenberg is even truer today, and you can choose your favorite topic: pandemics, climate change, financial crises, proliferation of WMDs, terrorism, it goes on. And to state the obvious, the United States and no one else can manage globalization or protect itself from most of these ills. Tending one's garden is simply not a sensible strategy in 2018. Unfortunately, and this is the reason I tried to write the book, this reality, like lots of others, is not present at the largely evidence-free zone in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. So, the America First Committee lasted 11 months until Pearl Harbor. Trump's version has not as yet. So, at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the paradox is that the UN, frankly, is one of the institutions that's best placed, it's the logical location to convene conversations, to orchestrate action to meet most of these threats, not all of them, but most of them. However, its limitations, not just sovereignty, but the sort of obvious waste and atomization of the system need to change as well. So, how can the UN and how can one persuade the United States to alter views on this. For me, this is not in the book, I want to shift gears a bit and share some research from another project that I finished about a year ago, or 2 years ago, on the wartime origins of the United Nations. The proposition here is that there was a moment from 1942 to 1945 that represented a real existential threat to the West, certainly to the United States. I think in retrospect, people tend to think, it was a kind of a slam dunk, an easy victory. It certainly was anything except. And so I like to go back to that period because international institutions are about pursuing national interests and vital interests. And it's about leadership. This was a moment in which the United States calculated its national interest in a very different fashion and actually led the pack. So I want to go back because lots of people think, San Francisco, April to June in 1945. I go back to the 1st of January, 1942, which was the signature of something called the Declaration by United Nations. 26 allies, later it would be 44 allies, met in Washington. This was a commitment to multilateral cooperation on the military front, but it was also a commitment to that same kind of cooperation after the war in order to ensure post-war peace, stability, and economic development. I'm going to skip a little of this because I'm going on too long, sorry. Subsequently, in Washington, there are people like Michael Mandelbaum who says, well, we don't use social work. That's not what we're about. Well, in fact, the United Nations was a multilateral military alliance to crush fascism, but it also had lots of other components. Among those, which Washington not only signed on to, but actually led the way on, was decolonization, the pursuit of 10,000 war criminals, international criminal justice, the thoughts of post-war reconstruction and refugee assistance, international development, regulated world economic activity, agricultural and education policy, and the list goes on. This is exactly social work. So the planners in Washington and Whitehall, and actually worldwide, when you go back and look at the documents, rejected unilateral military might and lawlessness as policy options. We had just seen the second world conflagration. You should remember that the first one had been somewhat prematurely billed by H.G. Wells and Woodrow Wilson as the one to end all wars. So that the second version of that underlined the wisdom of just such an approach. So, what came out of San Francisco and what immediately came into effect in the UN system these institutions were not peripheral, but rather central to US decision making. So, if you thought back that the League of Nations, which fell flat on its face, partially because the United States was not present, you might have thought, well, would this not have produced kind of Hobbes on steroids as a result of the Second World War? But that was not the case. It was multilateralism and the rule of law, not going it alone, and the law of the jungle that characterized Washington's positions. Sorry for going on at some length, because it seems to me that governments then and now pursue vital interess. As I say, this was an existential threat. The outcome was not known, but this was not a temporary multilateral charade to toss aside when the going got tough. It was not the soft soap Anglo-American military might, but it was a commitment to partnership that has worked actually remarkably well in spite of all of the problems. So, 42 to 45, neither governments nor analysts calculated that we should go back to 1913. It wasn't the war, 1914 minus, it was 1918 plus, to build on those initial efforts and go beyond. Now, obviously, the Trump administration has forgotten this lesson, assuming that anybody actually ever studied it. And here's where most observers would say that it's really the Canadas and Koreas of this world, the kind of middle powers that really can use international institutions, multilateralism. I think that this case, and many cases since, suggests the relevance of collaboration, cooperation, multilateralism when the conditions are right and the leadership is right. So, what are the implications on First Avenue? Well, the first thing to say is, alas, Trump is not alone in this enterprise. This is the age of Trump, but it's also the age of Putin, Erdogan, Xi, Modi, Duterte, El-Sisi, Maduro, and the list goes on, including too many countries in Western Europe. So, I still think it's important to look at how the UN's, I think, most important member, certainly its largest financial contributor, what it's tried to do, how it's conceived of what's important. I mentioned the UNFPA cut. This is $70 million, a quarter of that budget, but this is a trivial, frankly, expenditure. A lot of hoopla was made about cutting back on peacekeeping operations. Save $1 billion. That ended up being $600 million, actually. The US share is 170. So we got $240 million, which is a rounding error in the budget. But what it does do is hurt morale. It hurts other countries who are looking for an excuse not to pony up, to contribute. It empowers all of them as well. I want to go back for a minute to that September speech, because the president has pilloried the UN as no friend of liberty, democracy, and Israel. His speech started, like many of his speeches, with something that almost made sense. I mean, he tipped his hat to Harry Truman, to the Marshall Plan, to US generosity, the importance of the UN. And then, of course, he shifted gears and talked, among other things, about dismantling the web of intergovernmental organizations, and was the first person to have used the General Assembly chamber devoted to peace to threaten to annihilate another country, North Korea, with nuclear weapons. It may be, in fact, some of his related efforts that are even more telling and more dangerous for multilateral cooperation. I'm thinking here, of course, of trade, ripping up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, menacing NAFTA, throwing, talking about tariffs and actually implementing some of those, border tax adjustments, and the like. This has presented China with an opportunity on a silver platter. What could be better now, picking up trading partners here in Asia and elsewhere, setting standards with the absence of the US through the One Belt and One Road and other initiatives, coming out as the champion of free trade and predictability. I think we all underestimated the speed at which China would emerge, but I think we've all underestimated the speed at which the United States would hand over leadership. So Beijing was calm and the predictable voice for trade and stability. But I think it was the May announcement, we were speaking about this earlier, on Paris, that I find kind of the most unsettling. So obviously going it alone, in spite of an agreement that had been negotiated over decades and had 195 countries signed on, well, let's rip it up. Once again, I think China may be the most direct beneficiary of this myopic stance. It gets to play the role of partisan proponent for climate change, even though it's now the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases. You can't breathe in most of its cities. But here we are. They are moving ahead on green technologies, and actually significantly so. And meanwhile, the president is talking about coal, China's closing coal-fired plants. So this is obviously not going to make America great again. It's certainly going to make it more polluted again. So I think, however, that this may be the one area where U.S. electors hopefully will come to their senses in 4 years before the U.S. pulls out of the agreement. But even more importantly, U.S. cities, U.S. states, U.S. corporations are saying, whoa, this is in all of our interests. We're staying with this. So it is important that California is bigger than the country in which the agreement was signed. So this will make a difference. It will still be possible to get the United States back on board. And similarly, and this is where countries like Korea and the other 19 members of the G20 can make a difference. Last summer, the Trump administration was pouting on the sidelines. The other 19 said, no, this is irrevocable, irreversible. That stance has to continue. I should point out that, of course, the General Assembly has had actually better performances than the one by Trump. It's a bombastic and narcissistic leaders are not in short supply. The ones I recall best are, of course, Khrushchev's banging his shoe on the table, and Yasser Arafat checking his gun at the door and then waving an olive branch, pulls it out of his pocket. Hugo Chavez saying, oh my God, it smells like sulfur in here, referring to the fact that George Bush had been there. So there have been actually better performances. But it seems to me what really came out of this reification and emphasis on state sovereignty is that great powers can make big mistakes, and they're usually cut a certain amount of slack. For me, the best historical example, and you can imagine what a nice reception I received when I gave this example last year in Poitiers in France with a former prime minister, and I were debating when I compared Donald Trump to Charles de Gaulle. Now, I was attacking a saint in France, especially of the middle and the right. I certainly wasn't saying that the general was sort of less elegant, less articulate, had less historical grounding. But what I was trying to point out is that he, like Trump, had this visceral, atavistic, nativistic, Gallic nationalism that came to the fore. Before he became president of the Fifth Republic, he actually called the UN le machin, the thing. He was doing this as in Canada, before a French-speaking audience, of course, to try to say France and French speakers had to have room. The US and the Soviet Union couldn't dominate the planet. After he became elected, the first thing he did was to pull French forces out of NATO. Didn't quite pull them out, but kept them separate. You may recall that Trump talked about obsolete NATO. De Gaulle also, for a while, left the French seat at the European Economic Community, now Union, empty, the so-called policy of chaise vide. He had forgotten that the thing, actually, had liberated France, and that NATO and the European Economic Community had not only contributed to French stability and development, but the rest of Europe. So it seems to me that Trump's unilateral nativist perspectives will eventually revealed as short-sighted and as off the mark as de Gaulle's was. So the exercise in between is to rather hold the fort. And that's once again where countries like Korea really have to come to the fore. So, does the UN remain relevant? How does it remain relevant? I hope there are some answers in the book, but it seems to me that the UN is facing, under the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, a really critical moment. I suspect that the shots over the bow by Trump are going to become broadsides. We've got the World Trade Organization, was not quite a UN organization, but linked. The IAEA is going to be under attack for the Iran deal. I opened the book with an old quasi-joke, which is, a tourist is walking by the building on First Avenue and says, I asked the tour guide, well, how many people work here? And the tour guide says, about half of them. There is some truth in that statement. There is more waste than I'd like to see, but it's really an unfair and pretty ill-informed comment. I think where the comment is on target is the efforts have never ceased to improve the effectiveness, inclusiveness, transparency of the organization, to pull together these various moving parts. I see a couple of my students, they've already heard this before. But anyway, this has borne precious few fruits, in my view. A world in disarray, according to Richard Haas, has become more in disarray in the age of Trump. And it's precisely this moment that we need more predictable collective action, not less. I think what's going to happen is that international institutions are going to become more transactional. There are going to be harder questions about costs and benefits are going to be asked. I just finished a study of Swedish support for UN funds and programs. Sweden, which is probably the world's most supportive and least critical multilateral donor. The same traction for those arguments no longer holds in Sweden. They're asking the same kinds of transactional questions about costs and benefits that other states are. So the multilateral narrative is going to have to become much more sophisticated, I think, and those of us who care about it are going to have to present harder evidence. So, a couple of the stories. So, most people are totally unaware that a critical variable in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we've come to World War III in my lifetime, which is the lifetime of the UN, a critical variable, and if you look in the archives, you look at the letters, you look at the correspondence from both Kennedy and Khrushchev, was the diplomacy and the back and forth and the mediation efforts carried out by U Thant and his military advisor, Indarjit Ricky. So, this was obviously not the only variable that explains the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I really don't want to test the proposition that we can just totally do without this. Similarly, I mentioned the smallpox effort. If you want to really be transactional, there is a very good case for you. The effort over 10 years cost $300 million. Of that, only $100 million was executed by the WHO. Of that, only about $30 million was the US contribution. What are the benefits? In the 45 years since it was eliminated, billions of dollars annually on vaccines, administration, border crossings, and the whole works. And I think you can make the same kinds of arguments about a whole series of issues. So, I would be the first one to say, for example, the Security Council is hopeless, it's useless. Look at Syria. Except when it's not useless. When those same 5 permanent members and 10 elected members say, ooh, chemical weapons, that's not such a good idea. What do we have to do? The UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Similarly, the Ebola epidemic, there were lots of things that could have gone better, but a critical component was WHO. And I dare say, if there's any deal cut by Messrs. Kim and Trump, that the International Atomic Energy Agency is really going to be front and center in any kind of monitoring, verification, God knows what else. So these are the kinds of transactional cost-benefit economic analysis for our discussant that I think really make a difference. People will undoubtedly ask, well, what do you think about Guterres? I'm actually modestly disappointed to date. He's had 18 months. His honeymoon is pretty much over. And I had expected more of the kinds of things that he did at the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva by cutting administrative expenses, farming out certain kinds of activities. But there's still time. And in fact, probably, he's made the usual comments about we got to stop war. But the thing that he's really emphasized is actually more nuts and bolts issues. I'm hoping that he's going to move ahead more quickly than he has. Because it seems to me the UN's comparative advantage here is going to be sort of pulling together long-term efforts at global instability, a catalyst kind of for global risk management. And his job and the institution is far more important than most people think. So the waste, the overlap, the lack of synergy, this is hardly news. Academics, high-level panels, media, everybody's emphasized this. But I think it's actually time, and it may be that the tightening of the financial screws by Trump and others will sort of push to make the kinds of changes that I think should have happened a long time ago. If this fails, we're going to have a real-time test of my proposition that the world could be even worse off without the United Nations. So, you can find lots of examples in the book. I urge you to read it and take me to task. But I'm oftentimes reminded, that my aspirations are sometimes over the top crazy, et cetera, and that, the second Secretary General Hammarskjöld said, this body was not created to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. And it seems to me that basically the UN of the future is going to pull together more moving parts. There'll be less operations in lots of countries, just focusing on the poorest and most war-torn countries. But the important thing in my argument, I think, is that the UN has become such an embedded part of today's world order that we kind of take it for granted. Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister, wrote recently, "We are barely conscious of the continuing stabilizing role it plays, the UN plays, in setting the broad parameters for the conduct of international relations." He continues, "If one day the UN disappears, or more likely, and I think this is what's more likely, just kind of slides into neglect and decays, it's only then that we'd become aware of the gaping hole this would leave in what remained of the post-war order." So I think that's really the takeaway from my book, that warts and all, we need this thing, we need to improve it. So the last line of Trump's speech in last September was the following: "We are calling for a great reawakening of nations." He somehow forgot that the United States actually helped to create a world organization to curb the demonstrated horrors of nations and nationalism. So what I think he and you should be calling for is a great awakening of the United Nations. Thank you.